So with this lecture, what I'm going to do is look at 6 cases. And the idea is that hopefully in the first part of a lecture, I've provided some of the tools and concepts for trying to understand how these cases have worked out. So the first case is about ethnicity, and it's about Russians. And this is, again, this is a quite unique situation, of course, because the question of Russians in Central Asia is not just a domestic issue. It's very much a foreign policy issue because of the interest Russia takes in ethnic Russians living in the so-called near abroad, in other words, the countries of the former Soviet Union. And as you can see, there are large amounts of Russians all through the former Soviet Union. These figures are quite recent. In Central Asia, the largest community of Russians is in Kazakhstan. In 1991, it was around about 40% of the population. I think this is quite a recent figure, 23.7%, but changing all the time. And very much concentrated in the north of the country. Not exclusively, because also in major cities like Almaty, but certainly in terms of the rural population and small towns, it's in the north of Kazakhstan, but most of the ethnic Russian population is concentrated. And this, of course, naturally enough, is close to the border with Russia, but that also gives an additional kind of sting to the situation when you have a particular ethnic group living along the border, across the border, or just across the border from the mother country, or whatever you want to call it. So this has been an important issue from the very beginning in Kazakh-Russian relations, as well as in terms of Kazakhstan's own development as a nation state. So first of all, it's a problem for Kazakhstan if you're going to build a state based around the idea of the Kazakh nation, and I think it was very clear from quite early on that Nazarbayev had this intention. How do you deal with the fact that, in fact, not too long ago, your Kazakh population was outnumbered by the ethnic Russian population? How do you deal with this very, very large portion of the population? But the second aspect to it, which therefore becomes involved in the first aspect, is that anything you do with the Russian population in Kazakhstan affects the relations with Russia. And it's not only an issue for Kazakhstan, by the way. As you see, there's quite significant numbers of Russians in Kyrgyzstan, and in the 1990s there were even more smaller numbers, but nevertheless significant in other. And Russia really made it its business to take care of the interests of the ethnic Russians abroad. So in the broader context, you'll find throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, so under both Yeltsin and Putin, Russian foreign policy concepts, Russian security concepts talk about the needs of the compatriots, the Russians abroad. And of course, the conflict over Crimea and Ukraine in 2014 very much involved certainly discourses about the Russian population, the Russian speakers, and the ethnic Russians of Crimea and of the eastern parts of Ukraine. So this came very much into the fore then. It was already an issue before the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it was Yeltsin and Nazarbayev who generally were allies for the course of 1991 and through the breakup and early into 1992. But this really threatened to destabilize their relationship. At the end of August 1991, shortly after the failed coup attempt, which really kind of propelled Yeltsin into the most prominent position in not just Russia, I would say, but the Soviet Union, Yeltsin announced through his press secretary that in the event of a breakup of the Soviet Union, the question of borders between the republics might need to be revised. Now, actually, this was more to do with the situation with Ukraine, but it was Nazarbayev and the leadership in Kazakhstan who reacted most violently to this declaration, the suggestion that that Russia was thinking about redrawing its borders, because obviously this northern part of Kazakhstan would be one area that would come under discussion if there was to be any redrawing of borders along ethnic lines. So there was a major crisis in relations between the two then. It was very quickly patched over. Yeltsin's deputy, Rudskoy, went to Almaty and signed various agreements with Nazarbayev and the Kazakh leadership, including all kinds of agreements about the protection of national minorities. And this is also something you get throughout the 1990s, is agreements over national minorities, which in this context mostly means Russians, because it's Russia that's pushing these clauses in agreements. I'll come back to those in just a moment. The importance of Russians abroad for Russian policy was emphasized at the end of 1992 when the Russian Foreign Minister, Andrei Kozyrev, talking about Russian intervention in Tajikistan, justified it in part on the fact that, and this is a quote, "we must also remember that Russians live there. Russia must act as a peacemaker." So the Russian involvement in the Tajik civil war, which I'll talk about separately, was, good question, of course, was it just a justification to sell to the Russian public, or was it a real reason for Russia intervening in the civil war? But anyway, this idea of the need to be a peacekeeper in a region where there were significant numbers of Russians was used to justify military intervention already in 1992. More commonly, the interests of Russians would be taken care of through these agreements and forcing really the Central Asian republics and then states to accept clauses guaranteeing the rights of national minorities, i.e. particularly Russians. This already occurred, for example, in July 1991, where the Russian Soviet Republic loaned 800 million rubles to Kyrgyzstan, but put a clause in that loan agreement about guaranteeing the rights of the populations of each other's republics, and this is primarily to safeguard the position of Russians in Kyrgyzstan, and this is quite typical. So, and in the post-Soviet said between 1992 and 1995, a series of agreements, bilateral agreements between Russia and Central Asian states, which might be trade agreements, they might be whatever, but they would insert these clauses about protection of minorities. It also figured prominently in the multilateral organization, the Commonwealth of Independent States, which was set up at the end of 1991, and one of its functions was also or one of the functions that was pushed by Russia was to safeguard the rights of Russia's minorities. And so this has always been a big feature in relations, particularly involving Kazakhstan and Russia, and at times it's been very problematic. Partly because of the situation of the Russian population itself. So without apparent prompting for the centre, you already had in 1993 to 1994 the emergence of Cossack organisations in northern Kazakhstan, demanding some kind of self-rule and possibly reunification with Russia. And the Russian Ministry of Justice registered a Siberian Cossack force, which included substantial membership in Kazakhstan. So this was, again, an issue between a local issue, if you like, initiated by the Russians, whether they were really Cossacks or self-styled Cossacks of northern Kazakhstan, but in any case Russians. And this triggered a response from Russia, which then provokes hostile reactions in turn from Kazakhstan. More serious incident perhaps came at the end of the 1990s when a Russian, a Moscow Russian, not a Kazakhstan Russian, Viktor Kazimierchuk and a small group known as Rus apparently planned to start an insurrection in the northeastern Kazakhstan city of Uсть-Kamenogorsk, Oskmen as it was later known, and to take it over and join it to Russia, to instigate, in a sense, a Russian insurrection against Kazakh rule as it was seen then. It was never very serious. There's some doubt as to how real this plot was, and the guy was arrested and imprisoned in Kazakhstan. But it indicated that there were some problems, of course, in relation to the Kazakh-Russian relationship, which has been a complex and ambivalent one, I think. It's never since 1991, cases of ethnic conflict, of fighting on the basis of ethnicity or violence or so on, or even of discrimination. You don't hear that there are accusations of discrimination, for example, in admission to higher education and so on, but they've never been at the kind of levels that might have been feared and indeed were feared for much of the 1990s. Kazakhstan has, on the whole, most of the time tried to manage relations with the Russian population on a kind of equitable basis. Initially, Kazakhstan, after independence, proclaimed Kazakh as the sole official language of the state, which of course was seen as excluding Russians, most of whom don't know any Kazakh or didn't know any Kazakh or very little. But kind of back down, first of all, then introducing Russian as the language of international, as in or inter-ethnic, let's say, to make it less confusing, communication within the Republic. And also, of course, Russian was the language of international communication between the former Soviet republics. And later on, it was indeed upgraded to be a second official state language. But that has kind of gone backwards and forwards and along patterns that are not very clear. So the official status of Russian in Kazakhstan has been kind of reeled back, and this has caused some kind of tensions, but not much. And I think by the time you get into the 2000s, Russia and Kazakhstan seem to have so much common interests, and they're so much more concerned by trade. But interestingly, there was less kind of protest, or there might be some verbal protest, but not much actual action in terms of Russia's response to what Kazakhstan was doing with its language laws, including going right up to the measure introduced very recently of abandoning the Cyrillic alphabet for this modified Latin alphabet to be used for the Kazakhstani language, which was not just seen as an anti-Russian move, but it seems to have been designed for as a kind of anti-colonial mood. And I think this is something to be looking out for at the moment and might be coming up in the future. I would love to talk much longer about Kazakh-Russian relations. But this is one aspect. There seems to be, and I was at a talk in Astana a couple of years ago by academics. At the time, this alphabet reform was just being introduced or being discussed at least. And they really saw it in terms of we have to rescue our culture from Russian domination. So at least in certain circles, this alphabet change is seen as a kind of getting rid of the vestiges of colonialism in Kazakhstan, and this whole kind of anti-colonial discourse is something that needs, I think, to be watched out for in terms of Kazakhstan and its relationship with Russia. Nevertheless, I think the general picture is that the rights of Russians are very much observed in Kazakhstan, and the other way of dealing with the kind of issues that arose in the 1990s with not just Russian, but specifically Cossack identity in northern Kazakhstan, and these people who organized along military lines and were more militant in terms of standing for the rights of Russians in northern Kazakhstan, is to not exactly put it in a museum, but do something equivalent. So this is a quite recent picture of Russian Kazakh-Russian Cossacks in Astana, in fact, and so it becomes kind of celebrated. It becomes kind of folklorized. Some of them you can see have got the uniforms and their children are involved and so on as well. And this is this is how you kind of take the tension out of this Cossack identity is to celebrate it, to make it something like a museum piece. So overall, I think the question of Russians in Kazakhstan, which is potentially one of the most explosives because of this cross-border foreign policy implication of how they are being managed, and it's very much a case of muddling through. I think the policy hasn't been very consistent, and it's something that needs to be watched out for as well, because it can change. It is changing. I think it has been changing in the last couple of years in a particular difference. Whether Russia will ever react to that more vehemently than it has done remains to be seen. There was also, of course, very high tensions, but perhaps unjustified tensions in 2014 in the wake of Russia's annexation of Crimea and all the discourse coming out from Russia about the need to unite the Russian lands, if you like, because this was part of the justification for intervention in Crimea and the Donbass. Well, would Kazakhstan be next? And there was a lot of fear about that. In the end, nothing much happened. And I think the fact that nothing much happened in 2014 illustrates that the underpinning stability of Kazakh-Russian relations in Kazakhstan, but that doesn't mean something would not be able to go wrong at some point in the future. Second case, which is much clearer in its outcomes and consequences, is two conflicts in Osh. One in 1990, so before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and another in the same region as 2010. I'm linking these two conflicts, as people very often do, but I should emphasize straight away they are very different, and the context is very different, and so on. What links them is that the protagonists are the same in terms of being mostly about conflict between Uzbeks, ethnic Uzbeks and ethnic Kyrgyz. The town of Osh becomes one of the major scenes of violence, although geographically, the two conflicts are not identical. But the other thing that links them is that in some senses, the conflict of 2010, even though it was 20 years on, was a consequence of what happened in 1990. And I'll explain why in a moment. So what happens very briefly in 1990, the collapse of the USSR, and as I'm sure you all know, we think about the South Caucasus, we know the violent conflicts that occur there between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, between Abkhaz and Georgians, between South Ossetians and Georgians, and so on. So this is something that characterizes the period of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And actually much worse violence, much more extensive and expensive in terms of loss of life in Yugoslavia, which was undergoing a similar process at this time. And so the fact that when we talk about Central Asia, there's only one major ethnic conflict we talk about, and this was limited in size when you compare it with the conflict over Karabakh, for example, and certainly any of the conflicts over Bosnia in the Balkans, that this was a relatively peaceful breakup of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, this occurred, and it perhaps needs to be understood, and it is to a large extent a consequence of what happened in the Soviet period, and it is also an indicator of problems which persist to this day, and which you can see particularly along this Fergana Valley region today. So first of all, let's locate Osh on the map. Here, so on the border with Uzbekistan, or just across the border from Uzbekistan, which also, as with the Russians in northern Kazakhstan, brings a kind of international element into this as well. And I won't go into any details. This conflict begins in 1990 over a relatively small incident, over disputes over land usage, but so significantly it begins in the countryside, but then it spreads to the city. It also, to link it to one of our other themes today, one of the reasons the conflict escalates quite quickly is it does seem that these clan networks are very effective in mobilizing, particularly on the Kyrgyz side, but to some extent on the Uzbek side as well. Whether we're talking about literal clans or kind of metaphorical clans, these kind of networks work very well in mobilizing people, mobilizing support for one side or another. So you get a very small local conflict between farmers escalating into a major conflict, including spreading into urban areas. And it is ended by the Soviet army. This is still the Soviet Union, so the Soviet army is sent into the region. And overall, maybe 1,000 people lose their lives, either as the result of the Soviet army intervention or as a result of the inter-ethnic fighting between Kyrgyz and Uzbeks. So it really kind of indicated the fragile state of relationships during the Soviet time, where borders, land usage, water usage were because of the nature of national identity, which I tried to explain a bit in the previous lecture, became very kind of harshly politicized. So just to give the kind of example where an ethnic conflict might occur, and this was just the one big one where there was significant loss of life, but there were many, many smaller conflicts around this time and indeed earlier, particularly in this Fergana Valley region. But if you have two villages, an Uzbek village and a Kyrgyz village, which are dependent on the same water supply, and water, of course, is an absolutely crucial resource in this part of the world, whether just for drinking water or for irrigation of crops. And the upstream village interferes with the quality with the water, either because it's draining off all the water for its irrigation, not leaving enough for the other village, or it's somehow polluting the water, making it undrinkable by the time it goes downstream to the next village. Well, this can happen, of course, in this kind of geographical location where water is important. But where it happens, where the two villages are of different ethnicities, it takes an altogether different character. So rather than the usual, I mean, for one thing, these kind of clan structures and the elders structures that can be used to negotiate these kind of disputes within one national group, that doesn't work so well when you've got two national groups going on. I mean, I don't say it never works, because this is always the first thing, is you send your elders from one village to meet the elders of the other village. But if negotiations break down, it very quickly escalates and becomes violent. And this is and it's still happening very much today in the Fergana Valley. These very kind of low-level incidents over things like land and water and border disputes and so on, and sometimes sheep stealing and stuff like that. And in the case of the 1990 Osh conflict, it was really this kind of low-level conflict, but escalated into something very big because of the dynamism of the ethnic situation resulting from that dependence on nationality as a resource that resulted from Soviet policies from the 1920s onwards. Interestingly, because it was still the Soviet Union, and so there was some oversight of the whole aftermath from the Soviet center, from Moscow. So it was mostly Kyrgyz that were put on trial and convicted in the wake of these 1990 events, in contrast to 2010, when it was mostly Uzbeks who were prosecuted. So I'm going to make that jump from 1990 to 2010. But one of the links here is that. As a result of the 1990 conflict and a feeling of vulnerability and of victimhood on the part of the Uzbek population, you get in the town, certainly in the town of Osh itself, but in other places as well, you get a kind of, I don't want to say ghettoization because that's too extreme, but I think there's another word for it which eludes me at the moment. But you get Uzbeks going into the so-called malhallas. Building their houses and their different kinds of housing, by the way, from what the Kyrgyz have, in particular areas of Osh. So the town becomes divided, becomes very clearly divided between Uzbek areas and Kyrgyz areas. To some extent that was happening already, but it becomes exaggerated in the wake of 1990 as a means of protection as much as anything. So this is one thing that happens between 1990 and 2010. Another thing that happens, and I won't go into it, but in terms of socio-economic development, because of whatever traditions, party traditions and forms of education and so on, Uzbeks tend to follow, in Osh tended to occupy the positions of the most important positions in terms as traders, of running certain kind of taxi networks and small business networks and so on, and perhaps to an exaggerated degree was seen as being a kind of economic elite within the town. I mean, I think there is some data to show that on average an Uzbek in Osh would have a higher income or higher standard of living than a Kyrgyz in Osh. But that also becomes greatly exaggerated in popular imagination and contributes to this. And that becomes particularly important in the years leading up to 2010 because there is an influx, in fact, of Kyrgyz from the countryside. Because basically, well, not just from the countryside, but from the small towns around Osh, because industry collapses completely. A lot of agriculture collapses with the breakup of the collective farm system, and so this is a crisis which is ongoing in various parts of Central Asia, but particularly again in this Fergana region. So you have an influx of Kyrgyz into the town from the countryside, and a shortage of housing, and various projects to build housing which are not completed, which are too slow, and so there's basically a problem of housing shortage, and this also contributes to the feeling of being underprivileged for the Kyrgyz population of the town. There are lots of other factors as well, including the actions of the local mayor, who in many of the accounts, and there are many conflicting accounts of the Osh conflict, by the way, the mayor shares a lot of the blame for kind of stirring up tensions and so on. But the biggest factor is actually on the national stage, and so this Osh conflict is part of what's commonly seen as a kind of north-south divide, or it's a spillover effect of the north-south divide in Kyrgyzstan. So it's the fall of Kurmanbek Bakiev, who's overthrown as president in the spring of 2010. Actually, he has a lot of support among the Kyrgyz of this region, but is kind of ousted by people more associated with the north. Won't go into the whole story, but this is what kind of adds a political dimension to the region. It brings a political dimension into the whole region. Kyrgyz politics is in chaos at this time. There are rumors going around that Uzbeks are trying to get Osh transferred to Uzbekistan, in other words, for the border to be redrawn so that Osh will become a part of Uzbekistan. And these all culminate, and then again, this is the atmosphere, and then again, it's relatively small events, which I won't go into, but involving rumours of rape in Jalalabad, a nearby town, so actually not actually beginning in Osh, but it then becomes Osh, which is the main scene of violence. And these scenes of destruction you see are all from the 2010 conflict. I couldn't find images of 1990. And it really involves attacks on these Uzbek marhalas, these Uzbek districts of the towns, and the wholesale very deliberate destruction of Uzbek housing, and more or less random killing of Uzbeks as well. Officially 426 people died in this conflict, mostly Uzbeks, but also some Kyrgyz. Unofficially, estimates go up to 2,000 deaths resulting from this. And very briefly, to add, because it's very easy in this kind of situation to think, okay, this is to slip into this kind of primordial understanding of nationality. Uzbeks and Kyrgyz, well, they've done it twice. They fought each other, they've killed each other. So there must be some kind of incompatibility there. And of course, you can see how attractive that kind of primordial view of incompatible genes or different cultures, different lifestyles makes living together impossible. But just the kind of countervailing stories. I mean, this is a picture of a market stall in Karasu, which is nearby to Osh, which is the kind of big market town, and dealt before 2010 with much of the cross-border trade with Uzbekistan, and again, most of the traders were Uzbeks, and partly because Karasu was so dependent on this trade, this cross-border trade, and trade between Uzbeks and Kyrgyz, or Uzbek sellers, but Kyrgyz very often the buyers. So you had, it's very often contrasted with the behavior of the mayor of Osh. The mayor of Karasu, first of all, welcomed refugees, people fleeing from Osh, Uzbeks fleeing from Osh, fleeing from the violence, were welcomed into Karasu, and stories of the local population, bringing them bread and so on, giving them giving them accommodation, and both before and after 2010, Karasu having policies of very active policies promoting ethnic friendship, if you like, which appear to have had some success. So even though it was down the road from Osh, the conflicts did not spread to Karasu. And there are other towns as well, mixed towns, including places which were central foci of the conflicts in 1990, where there was no conflict in 2010, and so which has been ascribed in large part to the measures of local authorities to promote local interethnic understanding and so on. So in other words, just to point out, there are things you can do about it. This appears to be the lesson from Osh, and when you compare Osh with other towns in the region where conflict did not happen. And some of the other lessons perhaps we'll come back to. But I should say a bit about clans, and I think this is really an example of the dangers and difficulties of using the concept of clan. It's certainly significant at local levels, as I said in the first lecture, where clan structures can be used to negotiate, to take over a lot of the functions of local government and local justice and so on. But what about the bigger scale? And this is the Tajik Civil War, which begins in 1992, continued more or less to 1998, but most of the fighting and was in those early years, 1992, 1993. I'm not going to go into the history of it. It's mostly characterized as a regional war between one part or some parts of Tajikistan and another. It's certainly not as an ethnic civil war. It's certainly not a simple civil war to classify. It's not like reds and whites that you have in the Russian Civil War or in other kinds of civil war, or workers against capitalists, whatever. But sometimes this is a lot of the authors, including the authors who write about clans, and this is why I'm saying it's problematic and a bit contradictory even, talk about it in terms of clans. So you have, this is how one kind of account of this goes. You have the Leninabad clan, which was privileged under Soviet rule, was given the leading positions in Tajikistan under the Soviet Union, named after a town of Leninabad. You have a Leninabad clan, which then, in 92, allies with the Kulobi clan. Now, this is a Soviet map, so these are a map from 1920s Tajikistan. So many of these kind of identities, they're not ancient tribes; they're geographical terms, which are then kind of used in the sense that they are clans. So you have the Kulob and the Gam, the Kokon Tepe, and the Leninabad clan from this region, or dominating this region, and dominating, of course, in Dushanbe in terms of political systems. So this kind of narrative goes: the Leninabad clan allies for tactical reasons with the Kulobi clan. There's no particular reason there's no natural reason for the Kulobis to be allies, but this was just an alliance of convenience. They're also associated more with the old Communist Party and continuing remnants of communist ideas, because it was Leninabadi who dominated in the Communist Party and ruled during the Soviet time. And then they're opposed by the more liberal opposition, but which is centered around the Gami clan, the Kurgan-Tirba clan, and also allied with the Badakhshani. And I have to correct one point from my last lecture. Of course, this was the Pamir region, which was autonomous in Soviet times and has autonomy as well. So this is another major case of autonomy based on well, but not based so much on ethnicity. I mean, this is a bit of a tricky question, what you count Pamirs on as, but that's not the point here. So the point is, this is used. So this term clan is used in this context to describe people who come from these different regions. And if you think about the four different kind of uses of the word clan that I had in the previous lecture, I mean, these are big groups. These are big areas. They're not tied together by family. I mean, within these groups, there are, of course, family clans, family ties which matter, but this certainly isn't what defines these clans. They're not really historic clans either, so they're more kind of metaphorical clans, but this is how it's used, and it's interesting that it's used, including by those authors who insist that clans are really embedded in Central Asian structures and are based on kinship and so on. And they use this term to explain this conflict, this very, very complex conflict. So it's perhaps a way of simplifying it, and it certainly, I think, shows the dangers of using the term clan. It's perhaps safer to not use the term clan to talk about regional interests, perhaps, and regional alliances in this context. But in other ways, of course, in other ways, it is about networks of people, and therefore it does suit some understandings of clans. Networks of people who feel loyalty and affinity to each other, even if it's not related to each other by blood ties, but more about place of origin than anything else, and not by ethnic differences either. So that's all I'm going to say about that, but you'll find, because this is the biggest example where this discourse of clans is used to explain what was one of the big geopolitical events of Central Asia after independence. So what about class struggle? I take Kazakhstan as the case here because a couple of interesting things. I mean, of course, as I said before, discourses of class and understandings of class not very widespread in Central Asia. But of course, there are different interests. There are different social groups. You can define people socioeconomically, and there are some kind of conflicts, and there are strikes. Mostly relatively small scale and low. So this particular strike, which I'm going to focus on in December 2017, it made international headlines, by the way, precisely because it was seen as unusual. But it's also notable that it was very limited. It was a strike at a particular mining company, ArcelorMittal. It didn't generalize, it didn't spread to mines belonging to other countries, it didn't politicize, there was no kind of solidarity from other groups of workers, and so on. And this is, I think, so this limited discourse about class explains the fact that this kind of strike can be quite kind of isolated and contained. What's interesting about this particular case, or about strikes in general in Kazakhstan, I think, is how they engage with politics as well. Because one of the things that was certainly a stain, or seen as a stain on Nazarbayev's record, was his response to an earlier strike movement in 2011. This time amongst oil workers in the town of Zhanaozen, where armed police were sent in and at least 15 people, demonstrators, strikers, were killed, and this received international condemnation, as you might expect. This strike at the end of 2017 didn't have that kind of outcome. It was fairly spontaneous, it seems, in the sense that workers at these mines decided not to leave the mines. They occupied the mines, demanding above all, a significant wage increase, a doubling of their wages. So it was a strike about salaries, nothing unusual about that in a way, and the way the strike unfolded was quite typical in terms of strikes in a lot of other countries. So after 5 days of striking, there is negotiation, there is a settlement was actually reached, and settlement which was well below what the strikers were originally demanding. But which nevertheless was sufficient for them to call off the strike. You also had, mining communities tend to be quite different from other worker communities, but this is a scene from this strike, but it could have been from, I remember the miners' strikes in Great Britain in the 1980s, where striking miners and their relatives and supporters come to the mine head, bringing food for the miners who are actually occupying the mine. So at a local level, at the community level, there's a lot of support for the strike. And although there is a trade union involved, it doesn't really spread nationally, though. Although there's quite a lot of sympathy being expressed and quite a lot of interest, it doesn't spread nationally. So it's localized, it's limited, partly for the limitations, because of the limitations that I've talked about. So far quite typical, but I've got two other images here, which you're probably wondering, what are those pictures there for, Professor Smith? This one, well, again, actually, ultimately, it's not that unusual, but so the company, ArcelorMittal, put out figures saying that these miners are already being paid something between like $600 and $950 a month, which in Kazakhstan is a pretty good wage. Certainly away from the big cities. And so miners responded by going on social media and posting. And by the way, these figures given by the company were also reported by the Minister of Labour in Kazakhstan. So you had the government apparently very much backing the employers in this case, but miners posting pictures of their pay slips to show that they were significantly less than this. So I've tried to calculate. I think this comes out at about $500, but the impression is that they were being paid much less than this, and so there's a kind of propaganda war going on between the strikers and the employers, which again is not unusual in any kind of strike situation, but it's quite interesting. But it's not that long ago. But in Kazakhstan, of course, using social media as part of this thing, but perhaps became more important because these, more kind of established channels of communication and argument that you would have in trade union movements in a West European country, for example, or a Central European country, these are not so well developed in places like Kazakhstan, and so this social media becomes particularly important in the kind of battle of ideas. And the last image here is perhaps the most surprising, Dariga Nazarbayeva, daughter of the then president, Nursultan Nazarbayev. Now she comes into this story partly because Nazarbayev himself worked for a while. His early career in the Communist Party was in this region. This is all in kind of northern part of Kazakhstan. Nazarbayev himself apparently didn't comment on the strike during the duration, but his daughter did, and she said this to a reporter: "This region is not foreign to him," in other words, to her father, Nursultan. "Its problems are of great concern to him. I am very sorry that ArcelorMittal management has allowed matters to reach this conflict situation." So I find that very interesting that the president's daughter is putting the blame on the company, whereas the Ministry of Labour is putting the blame on the strikers. So there's a kind of disconnect there. But I think this is also another aspect of, or perhaps it's an aspect of authoritarian rule rather than the classless society or the society where there's little class discourse. That you still have this idea of the paternalistic idea of the leader who stands for the interests of the common people. And is against the big businesses and so on. So a kind of populism. I don't want to overdo that analogy, but a kind of populism which also serves to undermine the identities of class and so on. Because and there's a very long history and tradition of this kind of paternalistic position of the leader, and you get it in Russia and other places as well. That we're for the little man or the little woman. There are ethnic repression in the big repressions in Central Asia since 1991. They're not on the whole ethnic ones. I think Andijan, for example. There are some, so there have of course been significant of national movements being repressed, and so it is. Whereas the picture we have mostly is of exactly that kind of paternalistic attitude towards strikers that we saw in the last slide, towards ethnic minorities as well, and particularly again in Kazakhstan, but I think elsewhere as well. The general aim is to try and put out an idea that we're protective, we're friendly to our national minorities, although that contradicts, of course, the aim of... It has a couple of contradictions, because it contradicts some of the the nation-building messages centred around the main nationality. It also becomes a problem when national minorities do start to put forward demands and to become visible and to protest, and generally the response then is to clamp down very quickly. I just put up here, because it's a very recent and ongoing case, the problem that, and again this is a foreign policy problem for Kazakhstan, and the Uyghur question is an ongoing question. This was just a couple of months ago. This Serikjan Bilash, this character here, who's the leader of this organization, was suddenly arrested because he's been agitating about the situation of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, across the border in China. And I'm not going to say more about that now, but except it's one thing to look out for. It's a particular form of kind of trying to silence a national movement, and it's a national movement which, of course, is not responding to the problems of Uyghurs in Kazakhstan, but the problems of Uyghurs in China. And therefore, for Nazarbayev and his successor, I suppose we should now say, this presents a foreign policy dilemma as well, but it does seem that for the time being that the answer to that dilemma is to move against these Uyghur representatives and their attempts to draw attention to the situation in China. And the last case in here, which I just really put up to contrast because they're alternative models of ethnic management, and I think when we think about a post-Soviet context broadly, we think about if we think about the Caucasus, for example, or if we think about Russia even, the tendency has been to erode national minority rights, to kind of resist minority national identities because they pose a challenge to the dominant narrative of the major nation, which most post-Soviet states, including the Central Asian ones, are trying to build their identities around. And the alternative form of management, and there is, and I think the most notable, it's not a very well-known one, so that's one reason I wanted to bring it to your attention here, of Karakalpakstan in the eastern part of Uzbekistan. In spite of the Karakalpaks being a very small part of the population, but historically they were given autonomy in Soviet times, and immediately in 1992 this autonomy was confirmed by Karimov in independent Uzbekistan. So you have this autonomous republic of Karakalpakstan, which really does enjoy a quite significant self-rule, and I suppose that's the general point I want to make, that in terms of language and therefore education, in terms of using its own resources as well as receiving subsidies from the centre. And one thing that Karakalpakstan is able to do as a result of that is to promote tourism, whether it's this kind of desert tourism that you see in the forts. Many of the desert forts are in Karakalpakstan. The famous art museum in Nukus, which I'm very happy to tell you all about afterwards, if you like, because having been there last year. And then it's also a kind of destination for so-called disaster tourism. This is what used to be, this is the town of Moynak, which used to be a harbour for the Aral Sea, and as the Aral Sea has now receded as a result of Soviet destruction of the environment, and what's left are these, well, actually these rusting hulks of boats have been put there as a kind of, they didn't literally kind of get left there by the receding sea, but it's a kind of museum piece, which also attracts tourists. I was struck in Karakalpakstan by how kind of active the Republic government is, how independent it seems to be from the central authorities in Tashkent, and how it is able to work effectively as a way of managing ethnic difference. So this is one model that we should remember still exists and still has the possibilities to succeed in this region. Having said that, I should stress again that, in spite of some of the problems that I've focused on problem cases, so the problems of the Russian minority, the very big problems of the Uzbek-Kyrgyz relationship in the Osh region, and some of the other problems, that by and large this is not a region that has been torn apart by ethnic conflict or territorial claims and counterclaims. In fact, those have been extremely rare when you compare with the Caucasus, or indeed with, of course, Moldova and other examples as well. But there is still a lot of ethnicization of politics. That's a heritage of the way national identity was really introduced into the region and was used to privilege certain groups. And I think this is really what underlies the Osh conflict in particular. And not impossible, of course, that this will happen again. And regional interests, clan interests, however we use those terms, national interests do have potential and are very much mobilized behind politics in many parts of a region as well, and more so than class interests are. And that's perhaps the main takeaway from this. And I'll leave you with some other takeaways and some questions, and we will give you some other cases that you can try and think about in this kind of context as well. Thank you. Attention.